Ahora los voy a dejar con Benjamin Dick. Él es Senior Director of Product, Identity y Data de IAB Tech Lab. Benjamin, welcome.
Well, thank you guys for the time and the opportunity here to speak to a project that I've been focused on for about a year now that we've branded within IAB Tech Lab called Project Rearc. I suspect everyone on this call is already familiar with it. I'm one of several product leads that have focused explicitly on this within IAB Tech Lab. So what I'd like to do today, I think I have about 20 minutes. 25 minutes to present, and then probably open it up for questions afterwards. But what I'm going to do ideally is kind of structure the conversation this way. First, provide some background on the problem space that Project Rearc represents, the process that we went through within IAB Tech Lab to deliver on several proposals and some of the bets that we are making reflected in the proposals themselves. And then talk a little bit about the details of each of the 4 components of the portfolio that we issued last month during our annual leadership meeting. So with that, just wanted to talk quickly about what IAB Tech Lab is. For those who are unfamiliar, IAB Tech Lab is an organization, a nonprofit organization that spun out of IAB in 2014, so we're not that old. But we focus explicitly on the technical details and interoperability that fuels the supply chain. So we operate standards like OpenRTB, VAST, and VPAID, and many, many others. There's over 30 different specifications that we look after. But our goal really is to create interoperability. We want to do this in a transparent, kind of neutral and collaborative fashion, and develop open standards for everyone to build their businesses on top of. I'll be talking mostly about Project Rearc today, but I really wanted to just underscore that Project Rearc is one of 4 kind of primary concerns and focuses within IAB Tech Lab, kind of in this privacy and addressability bucket around re-architecting digital media, but we also focus on things like supply chain transparency and security, measurement and attribution infrastructure, and we also have a focus on CTV and cross-media growth in multiple channels. So the problem space, I'm sure everyone understands quite a bit at this point. We've all been living in this kind of transition period whereby we're acclimating to the disappearance of third-party identifiers, not just cookies, but mobile identifiers as well, by virtue of some of the activities that we're seeing explicitly within Apple and iOS. But ultimately, everyone understands that these third-party cookies have historically been the connective tissue, the architecture and scaffolding around which most businesses are actually built to support all sorts of advertising use cases, targeting and measurement and attribution, and that's all going away. And Project Rearc was kicked off early last year, to help think about ways we can re-architect our own supply chain standards to put consumer privacy and accountability at the center of everything that we do. So we kicked this off in February of 2020, so about a year ago. And later that year, we joined forces with a number of other trade organizations who also wanted to think about this problem on behalf of their members. Those include the ANA, the 4As, the WFA, the National Advertising Initiative, and all of the kind of local IABs throughout the world who kind of sit inside this coalition called the Partnership for Responsible Addressable Media, who really brought a lot of non-technical stakeholders into the equation for us, especially agencies and brands who, frankly, at the IAB Tech Lab is not a core constituency and core kind of member base. So it was great to have a broad cross-section of input and interests informing some of the technical solutions that we started to develop. The process that we went through was very much modeled on software development process. Phase 1, which lasted maybe about 3 or 4 months, was really intended to understand the problem of the disappearance of these third-party identifiers. We all intuitively kind of understand the problem from our own perspectives and perches within the industry. But what we needed to do is holistically and very comprehensively document those problems so that we are all focusing on everyone's focusing on the same exact things, and we're not kind of talking in circles, right? So documenting the problem and understanding the problem was step one. Phase two was evaluating technical alternatives that will deliver on the problems that we documented. So what this involved was a lot of technology discussions and proposals, deliberations, picking and choosing the best ideas from each proposal, and ultimately netting out in phase three with a recommendation for a solution design. And we'll be getting into what those actually are in just a moment. And we learned a number of things as we went through this process. First and foremost, probably an understatement, but this space is very complicated. There's a lot of different organizations, commercial organizations, government input, legislators, privacy advocates, privacy engineers, that all have competing ideas, competing approaches to what a sustainable privacy-centric supply chain might look like. And there's also a large education gap and kind of incongruity in knowledge base across these key stakeholders about what actually happens under the hood. And so, there's no shortage of perspectives. There's a lot of speculation about what this all means, and frankly, just a lot of confusion that we ran into as we navigated this process. And then lastly, there are no guarantees in terms of the solutions that we're actually recommending here. This environment continues to change rapidly every day. And ultimately, we think that the bets that we made, as reflected by the solutions that we're recommending, are sound, but they are in fact bets. This is there's no sure approach to navigating this space when large platforms downstream of all of us are constantly maneuvering. The laws are constantly changing. And frankly, commercial interests are constantly evolving, and a lot of people are kind of running to their various corners of the ecosystem. So, with that said, what are the bets that we made? What do we think the future state will hold in terms of broader kind of supply chain activity and kind of interest more broadly in how we function? So, first, I think it's safe to say that privacy and data protection are by default are the new normal in our industry. We know that people have a growing awareness of the data ecosystem, growing awareness of privacy breaches, and there's frankly just a lot of distrust of corporate and political power and institutions more broadly that are informing the privacy debate more broadly. Governments and legislators have taken note of this, especially in Europe, where there's the GDPR and e-privacy. And they're taking legislative measures to impose restrictions on our industry and others in terms of what are proper data disclosures and data protection policies in order to protect consumers more broadly. And that's happening not only in Europe, it's happening in the United States, it's happening in Brazil, it's happening in many different jurisdictions simultaneously. So how do we think about that from the technical standards perspective, right? And create interoperability between all of those different jurisdictions. And then lastly, platforms themselves, Apple, Google, Facebook, are taking unilateral action outside of just legislative measures. So browsers, obviously with Privacy Sandbox and Chrome, are taking kind of paternalistic unilateral action to limit cookies and IDs globally across the board. Taking aim specifically at cross-site tracking and identifiers that allow for non-transparent profiling of individuals across different contexts without any kind of direct control. So Privacy Sandbox is explicitly intended to address that problem by simply removing access to information altogether and removing decision-making control from people and consumers and from companies. We're also seeing similar moves from Facebook, not in terms of data restriction, but in terms of consumer-facing data labeling initiatives. We see this from Microsoft Edge. We see this obviously from Apple with their restrictions on access to IDFAs and their most recent operating system updates. So platforms are taking unilateral action across the board to get in front of a lot of the concerns from legislators, and also to satisfy consumer needs around consumer privacy. The second bet that we're making outside of just the macro observation of privacy and data protection is that ultimately we think that consumers, data uses in general, and access and control over data uses is a decision between a consumer and the brands that they trust. So the publishers or the advertisers that they actually develop direct relationships with, and not the people in between. And ultimately, the choices that they make need to be able to scale up and down depending on their level of personalization that they want at the end of the day. And the technical standards that we develop as an industry need to be able to support those things. Some consumers are going to be much more comfortable with opening up access to personal information and identifiers for personalized content, for free content. And ultimately, we need to be able to capture and support those use cases. On the other end of the spectrum, there's going to be many people who are not comfortable with that. And we need to make sure that technical standards can reflect those choices and make sure that we, as an industry, create consistent consumer privacy experiences across different platforms and environments across the board, so that when you make a choice, you see it reflected in your day-to-day lives. The third big bet that we're making is that accountability and auditability are foundational to any form of addressability moving forward. So we don't think in the open ecosystem, at least, which is kind of where we exclusively operate, we can have open accountability and addressability mechanisms without technical visibility and auditable data structures that allow for individuals, either consumers or platforms or legislators, to actually see what's happening and how consumer privacy preferences are actually being honored in the supply chain. We know that we need to establish an infrastructure that allows for the passing of these preferences from party to party. But we ultimately, currently today, have no way of understanding the extent to which, well, A, how those identifiers are actually being used, and B, the extent to which those consumer privacy preferences are being respected. And so I'll talk a little bit in a moment about the accountability platform that we're building to help support this. The next bet that we're making are that open standards will be critical to delivering ad-supported user experiences in the open ecosystem outside of walled gardens and platforms. Think about the number of different variables that will go into how ad planning happens, how personalization happens, how delivery of ads, how measurement happens. If we think about the ecosystems in silos, if they're different for platforms, for the open ecosystem, for just Chrome experiences versus Safari versus Firefox, then nothing will be consistent from experience to experience. Ultimately, interoperability in the open ecosystem will probably suffer as a result. And so we think, obviously, as a standards body, that open standards for the ecosystem are going to be central to our ability to support independent businesses moving forward. And then lastly, there's going to be no silver bullet here in terms of technical approaches to addressability. It's going to be a portfolio of solutions. We, within our standards, have made bets specifically on in two areas, and I'll talk more about this in just a moment. But the first is intended to, as its technical specification, intended to help publishers monetize first-party data. I think that's pretty non-controversial for most people. But the idea is that how do we use existing standards that are already widely adopted to think about seller-defined audiences, so decentralized cohort development, in a new way, and allow publishers to monetize, but also do so in a way that doesn't expose their data to data leakage kind of across the board, and ultimately helps protect them from competitors or others who want to monetize the content that they have actually spent time and money to develop. On the far right side of your screen is this concept of linked one-to-one audiences. So these are cross-context audiences that help publishers and marketers connect kind of independently of anything else. So these are solutions like ATS or Trade Desk's UID2 approach, or SSO type solutions like NetID in Germany. But ultimately, we needed to create standards for data protection in these scenarios, because ultimately users in these scenarios are often signing in or providing an email address or phone number, authenticating, so to speak, without any baseline set of controls or understanding about how that data should be protected and how it should be passed through the supply chain. So each of those two things are standards that are part of the portfolio that we recommended. But we also need to acknowledge that browser and OS linked audiences and this bucket in general is going to exist alongside open ecosystem standards, right? Privacy Sandbox will be something that advertisers and publishers need to account for. iOS and Apple's SCAD network for measurement and attribution is something that most publishers and advertisers will need to account for. So again, just to underscore, we think that all of these things need to, publishers and advertisers need to account for all of these things simultaneously, and that there's not going to be a single way of handling addressability, targeting, measurement, attribution moving forward. It's going to be a number of them. So what are the standards that we issued? I'll probably try to get through this in about 5 minutes. I feel like I'm a little behind here, but bear with me. So there's 4 standards that we've released last month, 2 of which relates to addressability and 2 relate to foundational things that addressability needs to sit on top of. So the first of those foundational kind of baseline things is what we're calling global privacy platform, which is a technical approach to capturing consumer privacy, data use choices from consumers, and building a technical infrastructure that allows for interoperability of those data use choices when the regional legal expectations are different. So Europe will have its own expectations. The United States will have its own expectations. Canada, Brazil, number of Australia, number of Asian countries are developing their own expectations, largely modeled off of the e-privacy and GDPR. But understanding what those expectations are and having a common infrastructure to capture them is going to be very, very important to creating interoperability across jurisdictions. So again, it's not normalizing what the legal requirements are. It's normalizing the technical architecture underneath the legal requirements that allow for comparison of A to B, so that technical systems don't need to specify or have different designs for each country that they might operate in. And I think for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of go through, skip over the highlights because I want to leave some time for questions later. The next piece of the portfolio is what we're calling the accountability platform. And so this is an open specification to create auditable data structures that provide transparency into how entities in the supply chain are actually capturing and using the preferences that are attached to an identifier. So basically what this does is it opens up via kind of sampling methodology to anyone who might be interested, and ultimately allows for the industry to self-regulate by frankly commercial interests keeping each other honest right at the end of the day. We have a really, I think, elegant way of thinking about this by virtue of this concept of sender and receiver pairs, whereby a sender needs to log who they're sending their identifiers to. The receiver does the same. And then when that receiver actually passes it on to somebody else, they kind of complete the chain. So ultimately, we have an end-to-end auditable log of who actually has access to an identifier, what consumer privacy preferences are attached to that identifier. And ultimately, we can create very much like a tax code system, a way of understanding where there is potential misuse of those identifiers, because ultimately the sender and receiver need to log the same information. The third component of the portfolio, it relates to addressable designs. And it is focused specifically, as I mentioned, on helping publishers and also brands, for this matter, because they are also first parties, define an audience themselves, pass that audience to downstream buyers in a way that protects consumer privacy by rolling it up to a broader cohort that's sufficiently large enough to be able to not re-identify any one individual person inside that audience, and then create definitional structure around the audience signal itself and allow publisher A, publisher B, and publisher C to meaningfully differentiate the quality of their audience by virtue of this other standard that we own at Tech Lab called the data transparency standard. So this is a specification that leverages a bunch of existing standards, taxonomies, OpenRTB, the data transparency standard, datalabel.org, in order to help facilitate this use case. Without any kind of dependence on the browser mediation or auction mediation as envisioned by Privacy Sandbox. And then lastly, and I'll speed through this quite quickly, I mentioned the standards that we established around user authentication and user-provided identifiers. So the scenario when a user agrees to log in for access to content and agrees to provide an email address or a phone number for personalized content and services, or a scenario where an SSO is in place. So log in with Facebook, log in with Apple, log in with Google. So these are standards that create a common baseline for everyone who has access to some kind of user-provided ID, a baseline for how to encrypt that thing, how to pass it, how to ensure general data protections more broadly so that those use cases trading on personal data that's provided by a user actually has strong protections and teeth in place. So with that, I think I have about 3 or 4 minutes left for questions from the group. Sorry for probably going a little bit over time. But I just want to leave you with one last kind of call to action, which is these recommendations are in public comment. We're still getting feedback from the industry. And we would love for those who have read these and who have absorbed them and who have maybe identified improvements to submit feedback via our website, iabtechlab.com/rearc, which is also where you can find the documents themselves. So with that, thank you again for your time. Really appreciate it. And I'd love to field any questions that the group might have.
Hello, an attendee is asking, why would the IAB get itself involved directly in building this type of solution? Why wouldn't you let the free market solve it?
It's a good question. We think that there's always a role for the free market to develop commercial approaches to targeting and measurement and attribution. The problem that we see as a standards organization is that it's sometimes hard for the market to work with others without a common baseline way of talking to each other, right? So think of things like Bluetooth, for example. It's not something that we operate, but it's a technical standard that allows for many different competitive offerings to work together on a common specification. SMS, it's a common technical standard that allows for somebody on an iPhone to text someone on an Android phone. So we do everything that we can to remove ourselves from the rights of the market to actually define targeting and measurement and attribution kind of solutions. But ultimately, we understand that there's no way that those commercial approaches can exist without creating common interoperability between those commercial approaches.
We have another one. How do you think performance campaigns will be affected?
Performance, yeah. That's one of the big existential questions. And I think it depends on if we're talking about performance for advertisers versus performance for publishers versus performance for everybody in between. I do think that from an advertiser specific perspective, there's going to be a tendency to invest in solutions, in walled gardens, where real-time targeting and measurement and attribution will not be affected. So that ROI won't be implicated. I would caution, however, that might be a little short-sighted because the open ecosystem still does have a lot of value. But ultimately, there needs to be a lot of innovation on top of the standards that we're building to support real-time measurement and attribution outside of walled garden. So, performance, I think for marketers is really going to depend on your budget, your position in the market, and your access to first-party data, which is really going to be the powerful currency moving forward. For publishers, no one knows exactly how Privacy Sandbox will affect CPMs. I know there's been a lot of talk about 95% effective relative to cookies, but there's really no information behind that study. We don't know how Privacy Sandbox will work or the extent to which demand from Google will be affected relative to other demand sources. So I think at the end of the day, for publishers, performance and CPM, bid density and clearing rates, et cetera, are really going to be directly dependent upon their ability to test a number of solutions simultaneously, learn from what works best, and then lean into the things that are best for their businesses. And I think our portfolio of standards really does give them choices and helps them look at their monetization approaches in different ways.
Y bueno, gracias a Benjamin por la participación.